Hello, Tanse, everybody. So when I was just 12 years old, I buried my father alive. I don't mean that in the literal sense, but sometimes it feels like I do. I imagined him as a burial ground, a covered up one, forgotten, abandoned. One where someone would have to point out the site and declare, "It happened here. If you start digging, you will find the children." I always dreaded dinners at friends' or lovers' houses because of this inevitable question. So, what do your parents do for a living? It wasn't exactly polite dinner conversation to say, my father was a big-time crack dealer for most of my life, and now he lives in British Columbia, where he has 2 children with a girl who is the same age as me. For someone who despises lies, this was one that I granted myself. When I was 12 years old, I stood in a courtroom. My father was slightly ahead of me, a little bit to the left, wearing an orange jumpsuit. He was sobbing. I walked up to the stand, to the podium, and I read my victim impact statement. Or rather, I began to read it. My mother gave me a choice when I was 12 years old in that moment. She said, "You can go up there and you can read it, or I can get your Auntie Debbie to go and read it for you." But even though I was only 12 years old, I felt a significance for me being the one to go up there and read what I had to say. So I walked up to that stand and I began. I only read about 2 or 3 sentences before I ran off that stand crying. My Auntie Debbie came up and she finished the rest of the letter for me. In that moment, 12 years old, I was grappling with a very difficult decision choice, this push and pull of, do I love my father or do I hate my father? In that courtroom, my father was being sentenced for sexually abusing my older sister. It is one of the most difficult things any person in life could ever possibly go through. And yet there I was, 12 years old, having to let go of the love that I had for this man for my entire childhood and life. And in that moment, I chose anger, I chose hatred. And at the core of it, anger is really just this protective bubble that wraps around hurt. And from that moment forward, after my father, he went away, he went to prison, and my family, we changed our address, we changed our phone numbers, and we did everything we possibly could to get away from him. And part of that meant I had to cut off that whole side of my family. So in that moment, I realized I could no longer have my grandparents, my paternal grandparents in my life. I couldn't have my cousins in my life. I couldn't have those people in my life that were still a part of his out of protection. Protection for us and protection for my mother and my sisters. And as the years went by, I started writing. And of course, I had always been writing since the point that I learned how, since I was just 5 years old. I was writing poems, and after my father went to prison, I would write him these letters that I never sent. I would write short stories with imaginary endings, different imaginings for how my life could have gone. And when we cut off that side of the family, I wasn't just saying goodbye to family, but as a Cree and Métis person, I was cutting off those oral traditions from that side of my family, because as a young girl, I remember my grandfather telling me these stories about this figure called Witago, which is like a dark cannibalistic spirit in my culture that preys on the human spirit. And, so there was this severance of that, this loss that I had feeling that. And, years go by, and eventually my father gets out of prison. And at 17 years old, I made a decision. I knew that I needed to go and confront him to process my healing and my grief. It was a necessary step that I felt I needed to take as a young woman. And of course, writing was a way of me processing, and it was a way of me healing, but there are still other layers that you have to do. And so there I was at 17 years old, packing my bag and hopping on a Greyhound bus to go to British Columbia, the next province over. And I remember that day vividly. I was at my Auntie Danielle's house, so that's my dad's sister, and I was reconnecting with that family that I hadn't seen in a really long time. And I was sitting in front of this big bay window, and it was a rainy day, and I was waiting for my father to come and pick me up. I hadn't seen him in 4 or 5 years, and his SUV pulls up, and I remember that feeling of walking out to the vehicle being like, this is it, this is the moment. And I hopped into the vehicle, heart pounding, and there he was, this man that was half of me, but yet I had never felt more further away from someone. And his eyes were a little bit red and glassy, and he was a little bit thicker than I remembered him to be, but still the same. And so we drove and we drove and we drove until eventually we found a place called Bear Creek Park, a place that we went when I was a little girl. And the time for small talk was over. We hopped out of that vehicle, the rain was falling, and we just started walking until neither one of us had to say anything, but we saw this old red cedar that had fallen over, and we both just walked straight for it, and we hoisted ourselves up and we sat upon it, and the small talk was over. And I looked at him and I said, how could you do it? Like, how could you do this to our family? And he looked at me and he apologized, and he was like, I victimized your heart, souls, bodies, and minds, and I'll never forgive myself. And he just sat there sobbing, and it was like the courtroom all over again, except this time all my tears were dried up. I didn't shed a single tear in that moment, and after the conversation, we got back in the vehicle, and we started driving, and we drove, and we found a place, and we had lunch together. And in that moment, it was strange how easy it was to fall into this rhythm. I'm just sitting across from my father having lunch now. And in that moment, I was almost angry at myself because I could feel the love that I had for him still there and still present. And I thought I had buried that away. I thought I had let that go. I thought it no longer had a place in my life. And leaving that lunch, you know, I felt all these conflicting emotions, and I started writing more, and I wrote this whole bit about it. And ultimately, I decided that it was time for me to go home. I had to go back and be with my sisters and be with my mother out of loyalty and out of love. How could it be okay for me to still love this man after what he did? And so out of loyalty, I left, and that was the last time that I saw my father. The years kept moving, and I kept writing, and I was considered myself like a detective. I had this magnifying glass to my life and this question in my mind of, how could this happen? How could a tragic thing like this happen to a family? And I took that magnifying glass and I just started analyzing my lineage and analyzing all of our stories, mine, my mother's, my grandparents', my father's, and ultimately it led me back to me realizing I needed to reconnect with my grandfather. I needed to hear his life and hear his stories as a way of understanding my father and what he had done. And I remember when I realized that, I had texted my father and I said, do you remember any stories about Wheat-to-Go or Wasaki Chalk? I really want to unlock those doors. And he texted me back and he said that his doors were many and locked up. And not too long after that, I was sitting at a sports bar, and I got this phone call from a phone number in Vancouver. And so I answered this phone call, and a big voice on the other side says, Tansei. And immediately I knew that that was my grandfather, even though I hadn't heard his voice in many, many years, over a decade. And he says to me, I think it's time I start telling you about your grandpa's life. And so from that point forward, we started having these conversations over Zoom, and we started connecting, and he started sharing with me the stories about Wheatago and Wasakichak. But he also started telling me about his life, and one of the moments, he was talking about who he was before, because the man who raised my father was not the grandfather that was present in my life. It was a very different man. And he said, I carried a lot of anger with me for many, many years, too many years. And I asked him a really difficult question, and that question was, where do you think that anger came from? And this man started crying, and he said, it came from the moment that they ripped us out of our homes. And then he started detailing me the story. He was the oldest of 10. He had 10 siblings, and he was the oldest. He was 16 years old when him and all of his siblings were forcibly taken from their mom during a movement called the 60 Scoops. And if you're not familiar with what the 60 Scoops are, the 60 Scoops was a movement that happened in Canada where Indigenous children were taken away forcibly from their family members and were put into the foster care system and raised in white families as a way to eradicate who we are. And so I listened to his story, and in listening to that, all of this understanding really kind of came before me. And so me with that magnifying glass understanding, it was like these light bulbs were clicking, and both of us were making space for one another, listening to one another. And, he was open about these experiences, knowing that I was writing this book and wanting his story to be a part of this book, Soft as Bones. And so, this journey that I've been on with writing Soft as Bones has been this really beautiful healing experience of me analyzing my life, but also holding space for my family members to share truths that they had buried and locked away for a long time that were negatively impacting their lives. And so when I finally got to the end of the book, Soft as Bones, it became so clear to me that, life is more complicated than dichotomies. It's not that love versus anger, or love versus hatred, or healed versus broken. There have been moments when I have felt broken, but I am still healed. And there has been moments when I am healed, but I have still experienced moments of brokenness. And so coming to the end of that book, I kind of felt like this grain of sand suspended in water, not quite connected to the seafloor, but not yet connected to the surface, and just kind of floating there. And at the end of it, I realized that all of us, we are all soft as bones. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be soft as bones? Soft as bones allows space for fragility and strength to exist at the same time. It allows contradictory emotions to be present and for that to be okay. And, softness is not the opposite of strength, but rather strength is this container that holds space for all of the complexity of what it means to be a human being. Thank you.